Stories.
I was 16, and me and my friends, I'll call Evan and Jake, wanted to rent a hotel for the night since it was spring break. We got to the hotel and checked in. It had a really funky smell, but we still stayed there. Once we got to our room, it was about 3 p.m., so we decided to go swimming. The pool was downstairs, departed from the hotel. Once we got to the entrance, there was a man, at least 6'3", in all black, with a hood covering his face, facing us. I panicked a little, but not out loud. We got into the pool and swam for a few hours until we saw the man again, all black, sitting on a chair by the pool. I cleared my throat. Can I help you, sir? I asked. No response. I was still a little paranoid. I put my face in the water. At the bottom of the pool was another figure that was all black. I screamed like a little girl and ran for the door. I looked back and saw nothing. Not the guy, not in the chair, or the guy under the pool. My friends thought I was just seeing things, but I saw what was clear as water. I didn't feel like swimming anymore, so I decided to get dinner at a nearby restaurant. I got a table for me and my friends to sit at, and there was once again the man, all in black, on the other side of the dining room, and he was staring at me. I have had enough. I went over there, and I lost track of him, and he took off. After that, I decided this trip was gone too far, and we should leave tomorrow morning. But my friends didn't like that idea. Once it was 10:30. My friends and I dozed off in the hotel. I woke up to some noises. I saw a shadow of a figure at the end of my bed. I calmed myself and told myself that it was my hat that I put there before I went to bed. I went to bed and got woken up again 30 minutes later to more noises. I was getting thirsty, so I reached under the bed and tried to grab my water, but I grabbed something else, and I was totally shocked by what I grabbed. It was my hat. I was not ever more scared in my life. I couldn't help but to scream at the top of my lungs when I heard a voice next to my ear say, "You're a bitch." I jumped out of bed and realized it was two men in black right there. I tried to fight them, but it was no use. Once they grabbed me and dragged me out of that room. I tried to scream, but the guys was covering my mouth. I passed out and woke up in a stretcher. It turned out those guys knifed me while I passed out, and someone caught them. But the doctor said no one could catch the guys who got me. To this day, I always have a nightlight at night, so I'm not scared.
I don't know how I got myself into the situation that I was in, but I'm gladly here reporting that I'm safe. I know the steps I took to end up where I was, but I couldn't tell you why. I'm female and I just turned 22. I was ready to find someone to spend time with, since I was droning out at work and needed some excitement. I was looking for a long-term relationship, and what I got was a massive F*** out of the whole ordeal. I tried Tinder and Plenty of Fish to find someone and didn't. They were total waste of time, and I couldn't find anyone who didn't at least have two things wrong with them. I got off of that after a few weeks. I didn't want someone if they couldn't barely even spell out their own profile. I ended up giving up on dating sites, and I told myself I'd try again later. What did end up happening was, out of nowhere, was a guy messaged me on Instagram. Of all the apps I don't normally use, it was Instagram this guy decided it would be best to get a hold of me on. Who knows how he got my info or anything. but he said he found me on the dating site and he followed my links. I didn't use Instagram. I didn't think too far into it though. I started talking to him a while and found out that he was really close to my house. Maybe those dating apps do work, but fuck them. I talked to him for days and ended up liking him because I felt like we had a connection. He was really vibrating on my frequency, and so I decided to go meet him in a public space. We met each other at a mall in the food court. There were tons of people around, so I believed that I'd be safe. Him and I went to go get something to eat and sat down to talk more in person and really got to know each other. We then walked around the mall for the rest of the day, enjoying each other. I got the feeling that he liked me, and I wanted to hang out with him more at some point. But we had to go our separate ways after the mall closed. We figured that we'd see each other after the weekend, and we said our goodbyes. Once I got home, he friended me on Facebook, and that's when I got a shock. I'm not one to judge other people on their online habits, but this was a little overboard. By overboard, I mean he was one of those edgy posters that tried too hard to offend people. Once I tell you what it was that I saw, you'll probably think I'm taking it too lightly. The first thing that I saw was a picture of a red and black flag, and I don't mean the Confederate. You should know the one. As I scrolled down, I saw pictures of things I can only describe as severely racist and gory. It didn't look like anything had focus, but just seeing it was enough. I blocked the account and decided not to talk to him anymore. I wouldn't be seeing him anymore, and I wouldn't be going back to that mall for any reason, in case I may run into him again. I thought that that was going to be the end of it, but I was sorely mistaken. A few days later, he followed me on another account on Instagram, and made himself known by liking every single one of my pictures. There wasn't a whole lot, but still. I blocked that account. After that, I started noticing a white car sitting outside of my house across the street. It was him because I recognized the car from the mall. I looked out at him with a 48 times zoom camera that I have and saw that he was sitting there with binoculars. I was freaked out and I called the cops. I told them that there was a guy outside my house in a white car watching it. I watched them pull up to his car and talk to him, but they let him go. He drove off and I didn't see him for another while. One night before I headed to bed, I heard noises outside of my house. I looked out the front window and saw his car was pulled into my neighbor's driveway. I texted the neighbor that happened to be sort of a friend because we'd looked after each other. They told me that they went out and popped 2 of his tires and called the cops. I didn't know where he was or what he was doing, but his car was there and he wasn't in it. The cops got there soon after being called and checked the car out, and then came by my house to check on me because my neighbor had told them that I was in danger. Apparently I was, because he was found in my backyard trying to find his way into the house. He was arrested and charged with stalking and trespassing. I don't know what happened after that because I forgot about him for a long while. This wasn't actually too long ago, and I remember it very clearly. But hopefully my experience can teach someone else how to deal with a similar situation. Good luck out there.
I love my wife above all else. I have loved her since the moment I first laid eyes on her. I would do anything for her, and that has never changed. After all these years, we first met in college. We were both theater majors, and it was day 1 of Acting 1 class that our eyes met for the first time. She had chocolate brown eyes that were complemented by her dark brown curls. We stared at each other constantly that first day, and when we were parted together, we knew that it was fate. "My name is Margaret," she said, too, as soon as I walked up to her after class. I took her by her hand and kissed it. "Henry," I responded. She then took my long dreadlocks and wrapped it around her finger, staring me in the eyes and biting her lip. It was an amazing meeting, with an even better ending later that night. The following night, we went on our first date, a theater production of Suno. We held each other's hands through the entire performance, and afterward, I walked her back to her dormitory. Every day after that was like a love story. We went through good times and bad times. We broke up and got back together. Through it all, one thing never changed me. I loved her and would do anything for her. We got married after graduation and went on to become very successful in the stage acting scene. We were considered a power couple and were always cast in romantic roles opposite each other. It was easy to bring the true deep love that we felt for each other to the stage, and it was nice to make money from it. One day, our lives took a turn. We had just finished a successful performance of the stage play, The Clean House, when we were approached by a member of the audience. "That was an amazing performance," he said, a creepy English accent behind his words. "Why, thank you. You're sweet," said Margaret, gripping my hand. I could tell this guy had creeped her out, but being a talented actress, she was able to put on a nice front. "I've been watching you two for so very long time," he continued, his pale blue eyes staring into Margaret. "I am very much a fan of your work. Every performance is riveting, and I can tell that you put true passion into your exchanges. You two must truly be in love with each other." "We are," I said, stepping slightly in front of Margaret. We love each other very much. I would do anything for her." I looked at her, and she gave me that beautiful smile of hers. "That warms my heart," he said, as he put his arms behind his back and looking up into the night sky. "True love is a valuable gift that is often taken for granted. If you are not careful, you can easily lose it forever, and it can never be replaced, no matter how hard you try." He then looked at me, and I could see just how disturbing his pale blue eyes were. "Hold on to that gift. Cherish it forever." He began to walk away before I asked the question that had been bothering me since we met. "Who are you?" I yelled. He stopped and turned his head. "Your biggest fan," he answered. He then walked away. Margaret and I looked at each other, baffled at what had just taken place. Later that night, we were sitting on our couch watching a movie when suddenly there was a knock at the door. "I wonder who that could be," said Margaret, as she got up to see who it is. She looked at the peephole and froze in place before taking a single step back and opening the door. Standing just outside the door was the same man we had talked to earlier that night. He stood there with his arms behind him, his pale blue eyes shining like the moon. "Honey," I said, standing from the couch to join Margaret at the door. Yeah, please come in," Margaret said to the man, to my shock. "What the fuck are you doing?" I whispered, running to get the door. The man stepped inside before I got there and began to stroke her face. When I finally got to them, I threw my fist and connected with his face. Knocking him back outside, I quickly slammed the door and locked it. I turned to Margaret, who was in some sort of trance. I tried to snap her out of it. "Margaret!" I yelled, shaking her. "Margaret! Wake up!" There was nothing that I could do to get her to respond. I shook her. I slapped her. I even splashed water in her face. Nothing. Nothing would work. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. I looked around, and I seen the silhouette of a man standing outside our living room window. I blinked, and it was gone. I began to panic and run to the gun safe in my bedroom. Despite being theater nerds, we were very trained in self-defense and firearms. We could hold each other's own if our lives were in danger, and if there was ever a time to put that training to use, it was now. When I got back to the living room, I immediately raised my weapon. There stood the strange man, holding Margaret by the face. "Let go of her, motherfucker," I yelled, aiming for his head. He looked at me, and the only thing I could see in the darkness was glowing red eyes. He then turned his head to Margaret, and I fired, hitting him directly in the head. He fell to the floor hard, and I ran over. Margaret fell over, too, before I could catch her, before she hit the ground. She still would not respond, her eyes wide open in a trance. I looked over to the man, but he was gone. I gently laid her on the floor and stood over her quickly, readying my weapon once again. Suddenly, I felt a strong, tight grip on the back of my neck, and I was thrown across the room, hitting the wall. I groaned in pain as I grabbed my gun and slowly stood to my feet, shaken as I raised my weapon again, and he had a hold of Margaret, but this time he pulled her head close to his. I felt my heart race and my blood boil as he put her lips to his eyes just staring right at me. "No. No!" I screamed as I ran towards them. He then pushed her to the side and opened his arms to me as if inviting me to fire on him again. I obliged and fired 5 rounds into him, but all he did was allow them to connect as he laughed. I ran up to him, but he grabbed me by the throat before I could do anything. He pulled me close to his face, and I could see every horrifying feature. He had the most hideous eyes, demonic almost, really, but his face was covered in disgusting, pulsating veins. In his mouth were 2 sharp fangs, like rotten teeth, and long, slimy tongue, which rubbed against my face as if tasting me before taking his first bite. I lifted my gun to the arm that had a hold of me and fired twice. He growled in pain as he released me, and I connected the butt of my gun to his face repeatedly. He fell to the floor, and I mounted him, smashing his face more and more, harder and faster. I could feel the blood gush and spray all over the bones in his skull, crack and collapse. By the time I was done, there was nothing but smashed bone, brains, and blood. I painted as I stood back and limped over to Margaret, who was now fully unconscious. I shook her, and she finally opened her eyes, looking into mine with fear and confusion. "Margaret," I said, feeling relieved that she was all right. I held her close, and we laid there until I looked over to where the body of the stranger should have been. He was gone, and panic arose once again. We both stood up quickly. I turned to face Margaret and screamed when I saw him standing behind her, still in the process of regurgitating his face. Before I had a chance to react, he sunk his nasty teeth deep into Margaret's neck. She screamed in pain as I screamed in rage, hitting the monster in the skull once again with my gun. I felt bone crack again as I released her Again, I mounted him and went to work, growing ever more exhausting the longer it went on. I knew this wouldn't last, as he would surely get up again. It soon became obvious what exactly I was dealing with. He had put Margaret into a trance, merely by looking at her, even looking through a peephole. He had very bright eyes and nasty teeth, and he bit Margaret in the neck. He was a goddamn rapist, I thought to myself. While he was down, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed an old wooden brook. I broke it in half and ran back to the body, where I rammed it as hard as I could directly into his heart. The body began to convulse and flail, and his arms and legs were all over the place. Suddenly it stopped and went completely limp. After catching my breath, I slowly turned my attention to Margaret. She sat there in the darkness, legs folded and upper body fully erect. "Honey," I said, nervously approaching her. In the darkness, I could only see her silhouette until her eyes began to slowly glow red. There was only one thing I could think of to do. I love my wife. I would do anything for her, even if that meant chaining her up in the basement, feeding her a pint of her own blood every day while I figure out what to do about her. When the hunger would hit her, she became like a wild animal that cannot be communicated with. So I fed her my blood, and she became herself again. She understood the situation and never held it against me. It was very easy, but it was all we could do. Unfortunately, a pint only went so far, until soon it wasn't enough. So I gave her more and more, to the point I was endangering myself with so much blood loss. It was then that I decided to feed her full meals. It started with small animals at first, and then cats, dogs. Soon I made the hard decision to invite homeless people into our home, knock them out, and give them to her. This went on for far too long before it really started to affect us. She felt like a monster, and I did as well. I love my wife, and I would do anything for her, which brings me to now. I'm sitting here, writing this, shaking. This is literal blood on my hands as I try to compose myself. She asked me to do one last thing for her. I refused at first because I loved her too much. "Baby, if you love me," she began, looking me deep into my eyes, her now pale blues not blinking. "You will do this." Tears fell from both of our eyes as I pulled her in close. "I love you, Margaret," I whispered. "I love you too, Henry," she responded. I could hear the squish as I drove the wooden stake into her heart. I trembled as I listened to her whimpers, gasps, and eventually silence. I broke down. I laid there beside her now resting body and began to cry.
I'll first give a little backstory to my living situation. I was about 10, possibly 11, when my mom found a job working as a live-in manager to a quaint little motel at the end of my town. She took the job, we packed up, and left my childhood home. When we first moved in, it was a disaster. Holes everywhere. Certain parts of the house smelled horrible. We later learned this was because the old manager, Steve, was a druggie, and his wife was making and selling meth out of there. A couple months into living there, we had sort of fixed the place up and made it livable. At this point, my mom was working full-time at the desk. We had mostly stayed towards the back of the house because of the odd setup. The way the front desk where you check in is laid out was basically in our living room. It was tiny, cramped room with just a desk on one side and a door on the other, which led to our living room. A lot, and I mean a lot of people decided to just open that door whenever they pleased, and often got a view of whatever video game my brother and I were playing. This as a kid already freaked me out, and because of the motel past, many meth heads came by looking for Steve, who would walk right in. They didn't believe my mom when she said that he didn't work or live there any longer. One time, during summer break, a year or two after we moved in, I decided to stay up all night and play video games. I made a little nest in the living room and made myself comfy. It was around 1 in the morning after hours of Skyrim when I started to hear weird noises. Usually if my mom knew a regular would be late, she would leave a key in an envelope for them, which looking back doesn't seem smart at all. I heard talking. It sounded like two men speaking a different language. I figured that's what they were doing and would leave in just a second, but they never did. The talking continued for 10 minutes before I started to hear them pull on the door. First it was gentle, as if they were testing it. As they continued, it seemed to get more frantic, and I could almost hear grunting. Soon it was full-on banging on the door. I was confident my parents would hear it, but their room was all the way in the back of the house, which was about 3 hallways down. So after a minute, I figured that I was screwed and probably going to die. I was a super paranoid kid at the time. The banging stopped, and after a few seconds, I started to hear tapping at the window behind the desk in the house. I saw clearly a head from behind the curtain. The windows were high up, and he looked to be stretching up to get to it. He started to yank on the window, trying to break it open. While he was doing this, I saw movement at the screen door in the kitchen. At this point, I was absolutely shitting myself. I was petrified. I'm guessing the guy who was at the desk door now had circled around to the screen door while his buddy was prying on the window. He jiggled the doorknob back and forth, after a second resuming what he was doing earlier, and now banging on that door full force. For some reason, through my fear, I decided to try and be a ninja. To up my sneak level, of course, and army crawl into the little office part connecting to the desk. There was a key drop-off where people would just shove their keys into when they checked out. That was basically just a hole in the wall. I popped up, all while they were still banging on the door, and grabbed a pencil to lift up the flap. I don't know what I expected to see. They were clearly at the side of the house, but I just had a horrible feeling, like I was being surrounded. Turns out I was right. When I lifted it, I saw 2 more men standing at the door, hands in their pockets. I immediately closed it and almost cried. During this, I failed to notice the hallway light turn on, and my parents emerged, looking very distraught. As soon as my dad turned on the kitchen light and shouted, "What the fuck?" all the noise stopped, and the guys took off running. I could hear one of them shout something, and then nothing. Just complete and utter silence. After I told my parents what happened, the best that I could through hysterics, they called the police. The police showed up about an hour later and took the report. It didn't seem like this happened to anyone else in the town, but they seemed to think it was some Mexican workers who came up for the hops farm, and maybe didn't understand we were closed. I don't know. It seemed like they were just kind of race-blaming, but I never really got an explanation of that night. All I know was that they didn't seem friendly, and I don't know what they could have done if they got in. So to those 4 men outside of my house, let's never meet.
If you are new, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, as it really helps me out. And if you are already subscribed, welcome back and thank you for subscribing.